The infected cut. You have a cut on your hand. Small one. Maybe you caught it on a rock while climbing. Maybe a tool slipped. You clean it the only way you know how. You wipe it on your tunic and keep moving. 3 days later, your hand is twice its normal size. 5 days later, the red lines start crawling up your arm. You don't know what that means, but your body does. That's sepsis. And in prehistoric times, it started exactly like that. A small cut, a scrape, a thorn that went just a little too deep. Something so minor that you wouldn't give it a second thought today, because today you have antiseptic, antibiotics, and a doctor who can identify an infection before it spreads past your wrist. Your ancestors had none of that. What they had was dirt. Animal skin pressed against open wounds. Hands that had been handling raw meat, soil, and animal waste all day. The prehistoric world was not a sterile environment. It was the opposite. Every surface, every tool, every moment of daily life introduced bacteria into any break in the skin. And here's what makes this one of the most common ways prehistoric humans died. It didn't announce itself. It crept. A wound that seemed to be healing would quietly turn. The warmth around it would spread. The red lines, which we now know are bacterial infection tracking along the lymphatic system toward the heart, would climb the arm while the person continued living their normal life, hunting, gathering, carrying children, completely unaware that something was already killing them from the inside. Archaeological evidence from prehistoric skeletal remains shows bone infections at remarkably high rates. Osteomyelitis, a bacterial infection that reaches the bone, leaves permanent marks on the skeleton that survive for thousands of years. Researchers find it constantly. It tells us that infections weren't rare events. They were a routine part of prehistoric life. The ones who survived them were lucky. The ones who didn't left bones with the evidence still written into them. Something as small as a cut on your hand. That's all it took. The broken leg. You're running. Maybe from something. Maybe toward something. It doesn't matter because your foot catches between two rocks and you hear it before you feel it. A snap. Clean and sharp. You hit the ground and immediately you know. Not just that it hurts. You know what a broken leg means out here. It means you can't run. And everything out here that wants to kill you runs just fine. A broken leg today is an inconvenience. 6 weeks in a cast, maybe some physical therapy, and you're back to normal. In prehistoric times, a broken leg was a potential death sentence, and not always for the reason you'd expect. The immediate danger was immobility. A group of hunter-gatherers moved constantly, following animal migrations, tracking seasonal food sources, relocating when resources ran dry or when danger appeared. If you couldn't walk, you couldn't keep up. And a group that stopped moving for one injured member risked everyone's survival. In some cases, the group stayed. In others, they couldn't. But here's the part that surprises most people. We actually have prehistoric skeletons with healed broken legs, completely healed, which means somebody stayed. Somebody built a splint from branches and animal hide, kept that person fed and watered and protected for the weeks it took the bone to knit back together, and somehow kept the rest of the group alive while doing it. That's not primitive. That's community. That's care under conditions most of us will never face. But not every break healed clean. A compound fracture, where the bone pushes through the skin, almost certainly meant infection. And we already know what infection meant. A break that healed at the wrong angle meant a permanent limp, which meant slower movement, which meant higher risk every single day for the rest of your life. In a world where speed could be the difference between surviving and not, a badly healed leg wasn't just painful. It was a countdown. Childbirth. This one is harder to talk about, not because it's more violent than the others, because it happened to half the population, over and over, with no relief and no guarantee. Childbirth has always been dangerous, but in prehistoric times the margin for error was almost non-existent. No sterile environment, no medical staff, no tools beyond whatever the most experienced woman in the group had learned from watching others before her. No way to perform a cesarean section if something went wrong. No blood transfusion if the bleeding didn't stop. The human body creates a specific problem during childbirth that no other primate deals with at the same scale. As our brains grew larger over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, our heads grew larger with them, but the human pelvis didn't widen at the same rate. The result is a birth canal that is, by biological standards, dangerously narrow for the size of the infant passing through it. Researchers studying prehistoric skeletal remains have found evidence of this complication in the fossil record. Infant skulls found in the pelvic region of female skeletons, mothers who died during labor with the child still inside them. These aren't rare finds. They appear across multiple sites, multiple time periods, multiple continents. And for the women who survived the birth itself, the danger wasn't over. Postpartum infection was common. Hemorrhage was common. Complications that modern medicine catches and treats in minutes could take days to kill in a world without intervention. We sometimes talk about prehistoric humans as though they were tough in a way that meant invincible. They weren't. They were tough in a way that meant they endured things that should have broken them and kept going anyway. Every human alive today is the result of a mother who survived that process at least once. Many of them barely did. Starvation. You haven't eaten in 4 days. Not because you didn't try. The hunt failed. The roots were frozen. The river was too high to cross. You're sitting by a fire that's almost out and your children haven't made a sound in hours. This wasn't unusual in prehistoric times. This was just winter. Starvation is a slow death, and that's what makes it one of the worst on this list. It doesn't arrive all at once. It builds. The first day without food is uncomfortable. The second is painful. By the third, your body starts making decisions without asking you. It begins breaking down muscle tissue for fuel. Your thinking slows. Your hands shake. Small tasks require enormous concentration. By the end of the first week, without adequate food, the body begins to consume itself in earnest. Organ function starts to deteriorate. The immune system weakens. And in a prehistoric environment where physical strength and sharp thinking were the only tools you had, starvation didn't just make you hungry. It made you vulnerable to everything else on this list simultaneously. And here's what makes prehistoric starvation different from the modern understanding of famine. It wasn't a distant disaster. It was a seasonal reality. Winter arrived every year. Food stored in the warmer months had to last. If the summer hunt had been poor, if the plant harvest had been thin, if the group had been forced to relocate and couldn't cache enough food in time, winter became a calculation. How many people? How much food? How many days until spring? Isotope analysis of prehistoric human bones tells us this story clearly. The chemical composition of bone changes based on diet, and researchers can read periods of nutritional stress written directly into the skeleton. Growth interruption lines in teeth, called Harris lines in bone, show up in prehistoric remains at high frequency. They are the physical record of periods where the body simply did not have enough to keep growing. Your ancestors weren't always starving, but they always knew it was possible. And that knowledge sat behind everything they did. The tooth. It starts as a dull ache. Back of your jaw, lower right side. You press your tongue against it and wince. You felt this before and you know it doesn't get better. There are no dentists. There is no medicine. There is just the pain, and you, and however many days it takes for one of you to win. Dental disease is one of the most underestimated killers in prehistoric history. We tend to think of toothache as miserable but manageable. In prehistoric times, it was neither. Prehistoric teeth wore down fast. The diet was rough. Unprocessed grains, raw or barely cooked meat, fibrous roots and tubers, and occasionally grit and sand ground into food during preparation. By middle age, many prehistoric humans had worn their teeth down to the gum line. What teeth remained were frequently cracked, abscessed, and infected. An abscessed tooth is a pocket of bacterial infection at the root, left untreated. And in prehistoric times, it was always left untreated. It spreads into the jaw, into the surrounding bone, in severe cases into the bloodstream, at which point it becomes the same story as the infected cut, except it started in your mouth and there was nothing you could do to stop it from the moment it began. Prehistoric skulls recovered by archaeologists show dental abscesses at staggering rates. Some individuals show evidence of multiple simultaneous abscesses. The bone around the tooth socket eroded by infection. Jawbones with holes eaten through them by bacteria that had nowhere else to go. And through all of it, the pain, constant, unrelenting, no aspirin, no numbing agent beyond whatever plant remedy the group had discovered by trial and error. Just the ache that became sharper and deeper every day until either the infection burned itself out, which sometimes happened, or it didn't, which happened more. Drowning. Water kept your ancestors alive. It also killed them with a consistency that the fossil record quietly confirms. Early humans settled near water because they had no choice. Rivers and lakes provided drinking water, fish, plant life along the banks, and travel routes through difficult terrain. But water doesn't care how much you need it. A river in flood doesn't distinguish between the person crossing it out of desperation and anything else in its path. Prehistoric humans couldn't swim the way modern humans learned to. Not because they were incapable, but because the bodies of water they lived near were often dangerous enough that entering them deeply wasn't a habit worth developing. Cold water in a glacial river could cause muscle failure within minutes. Currents in seasonal floods were powerful enough to move boulders. Children were especially vulnerable. A moment of inattention at the riverbank. A child who wandered too close while the adults were occupied. The bank of a prehistoric river wasn't a recreational space. It was a working environment full of hazards, and children in prehistoric groups were not supervised the way modern children are. They moved freely within the camp and its surroundings from a young age, which meant the water was always close and always accessible. We don't find drowning in the skeletal record the way we find infection or fracture. Water leaves no mark on bone, but the circumstantial evidence is everywhere. Settlements built at the water's edge, groups that depended on river crossings as part of seasonal migration, A world without bridges, without boats sophisticated enough for deep water, without any of the infrastructure we use to keep water at a manageable distance. Your ancestors needed water to survive, and sometimes the water decided otherwise. The fall. The prehistoric world was vertical in a way the modern world isn't. Your ancestors climbed. They climbed to scout terrain, to reach bird, eggs, and honey, to escape ground predators, to cross landscape that had no path through it at ground level. They climbed because staying on the ground wasn't always the safest option, and sometimes they fell. A fall from height in prehistoric times meant hitting uneven ground with no padding, no helmet, no one nearby with any ability to treat a head injury or internal bleeding, a broken wrist from catching yourself on the way down, a shattered ankle from landing wrong on rocky terrain, a skull fracture from a branch that caught you on the way to the ground. Traumatic brain injury shows up in prehistoric skeletal remains more frequently than most people realize. Skull fractures, some healed and some not, appear across the fossil record at rates that tell us falls and blows to the head were common events. Some of these injuries were almost certainly from falls, others from other causes. But the healed ones tell the same story the healed broken legs told. Someone survived something that should have killed them because someone else kept them alive long enough to recover. The ones who didn't heal didn't leave that evidence. They left a different kind, an unhealed fracture, a skeleton found alone, away from the group, at the base of something high, the predator. You already know this one. Maybe you've thought about it before. The idea of living in a world where something larger and faster than you considered you food. But here's what most people miss. It wasn't the dramatic attack in the open field that killed most prehistoric humans. It was the moment of inattention, the person who walked slightly too far from camp, the child who chased something into the tall grass, the hunter who tracked an animal into territory where something else was already waiting. Predators didn't announce themselves. A crowned eagle dropped from 200 feet in complete silence. A large felid like Dinophilus didn't roar before it attacked. It waited. It watched. It chose the moment when its target was alone, distracted, and away from the fire. Fire was the single most important protection prehistoric humans had against ground predators. Not weapons, not numbers. Fire. Because almost every large predator that shared the landscape with early humans had one thing in common. They were afraid of it, which meant that the perimeter of the firelight was the perimeter of relative safety. Step outside it at night and you stepped into a different world entirely. One where the rules changed and the things moving in the dark had infinitely more experience navigating it than you did. Your ancestors knew this. It's why they kept fires burning through the night. It's why someone always stayed awake. It's why the darkness just beyond the camp had a quality that went beyond simple fear of the unknown. It wasn't unknown. They knew exactly what was out there. That's what made it terrifying. The cold. You think you know what cold feels like. You don't. Not this cold. The cold your ancestors survived during peak ice age periods was not the cold of a bad winter morning before you get to your heated car. It was sustained, weeks-long, bone-deep cold that killed through a process so gradual and so deceptive that the people it killed often didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. Hypothermia doesn't feel like freezing to death. In the early stages, it feels like exhaustion. Your movements slow. Your thinking blurs. Simple decisions become difficult. And then something strange happens that researchers call paradoxical undressing. As hypothermia reaches its later stages, the blood vessels near the skin suddenly dilate. The dying person feels a sudden rush of intense warmth, and they take their clothes off. Bodies found in prehistoric contexts sometimes show evidence consistent with this, positioned in ways that suggest the person lay down, removed coverings, and never got back up. Not because they gave up, because their body convinced them they were warm. Animal skins and fire were the only defenses your ancestors had against this. In a bad winter, if the fire went out and the group's stored fuel was gone and the temperature outside was -20, the fire going out wasn't an inconvenience. It was the beginning of the end. The cold didn't care how strong you were. It didn't care how experienced you were. It just waited. And if you gave it long enough, it won. The stranger. You're at the edge of your camp when you see them. Across the valley, a group you don't recognize. Different fire, different tools. Different everything. Your hand tightens around whatever you're holding, because you already know the rule. In prehistoric times, there was no such thing as a friendly stranger. There was only your group, and everyone else. In 2012, researchers excavating a site called Nataruk near Lake Turkana in Kenya found something that stopped them cold. 27 skeletons scattered near the edge of an ancient lagoon. Bound wrists, crushed skulls, flint blades still embedded in the bone, projectile wounds to the neck and head. This happened approximately 10,000 years ago. And it looks exactly like a massacre. Nataruk is the oldest confirmed evidence of organized group violence in the archaeological record, but it almost certainly wasn't the first time it happened. It was just the first time the evidence survived clearly enough for us to read it. Resources in prehistoric times were finite and specific: a valley with good hunting, a riverbank with reliable plant food, a cave system that provided shelter through winter. These weren't things your group could easily replace if another group took them, which meant that the arrival of strangers wasn't a social event. It was a threat assessment. Some encounters ended in trade, some ended in absorption. Strangers welcomed into the group when numbers were low, but some ended the way Natteruk ended, quickly and completely. The wounds on the Natteruk skeletons weren't defensive. They were the wounds of people who were surprised, overwhelmed, and given no opportunity to respond. Someone planned that. Someone chose the moment carefully and executed it with the kind of coordination that requires trust, communication, and shared intent. We like to think of prehistoric violence as chaotic and impulsive. Natteruk tells us it wasn't always. Sometimes it was deliberate. Sometimes it was strategic. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the prehistoric world wasn't a predator, a broken bone, or a bitter winter. Sometimes it was the group on the other side of the valley who wanted what you had.